Okay, I want to welcome everybody to our August Tales of Tryon presentation. We're gratified by the support we've had for this event. We have almost a full house here, and I'm sure a few more people will come in, but I don't want to take any more of the speaker's time. I'll tell you just a word about him. Many of you know a lot about him already, I'm sure, because he's almost a North Carolinian and Western North Carolinian, though he hailed from Texas in the first place. But he came to the University of Asheville in 1973 as a history professor and retired there several years ago and is an emeritus professor of history now. Dr. Milton Ready, PhD, came from the University of Georgia, and shortly after earning it there, shortly after earning it there, he moved to North Carolina. Milton is a historian who knows how to write. And you might think, so what? But it's not necessarily that common. This book is engrossing. If you haven't read it, you should. I've lent my copy to Mike McHugh, and he said, that man knows how to write. I thought, well, what would you expect? But as I say, you can't take too many. There are a lot of things you can't take for granted. But anyway, there's a good assortment of Milton's books up here. He's written other things besides that. He would be glad to talk to you about it, sign autographs, or anything else after the presentation. He is an expert on the history of at least two states, of North Carolina and of Georgia. And really, as far as I'm concerned, that's the definitive book now. Milton has a special place in my heart. I don't mean to talk about myself, but I've just recently finished writing a book, too, on the history of the trucking industry in North Carolina. Milton, 4 years ago, we were having lunch one day, Linda Lee, Milton and I mentioned that book in passing, and Milton said, I want to read it. I said, it's not finished. That doesn't make any difference. I want to read what you've written. So I gave him, I think, about 4 chapters I'd written at the time. And his encouragement in that project, he seemed to like it, gave me the courage to go a little bit further with it. Finally, after 7 years, about 3 or 4 more years after that, 4 or 5 maybe, I finished it. I'm just down to collecting my last few photographs now. But Milton is going to talk about what he knows best. Some outlines of the talk were back there, and I won't steal his thunder by telling you what he's going to say. You'll find out soon enough. But I know you'll enjoy it, and I know you'll enjoy anything that he's written. He's an excellent teacher and an excellent writer, and we are honored to have him here today. We are committed to quality in this program. We want to make it a bigger and better event all the time, and we're getting good caliber speakers, as well as some local entertainment like Bill McCall here. Who was a big hit a couple sessions ago. So we're going to have a mixture of things. But here's Milton to tell us about Governor Tryon, the Indians, the settlers who came before that, and the whole story. So I'll give you Milton Ready.
First of all, I want to thank all of you for coming. And Dick has left out my most important achievement. I married Lita West. Anita introduced me to Tryon and to so many of you, and I am so glad to see so many old friends here, mostly Nita's, but it's good to see you. Also difficult for me to talk about Tryon and Tales of Tryon, since so many of you know so much about it. But I'm going to start by giving you 2 sort of narratives. And before I do, I go back a long way with Ray Gasperson, too. And we started university together a long time ago. But 2 things. First of all, I hope all of you understand and realize what a very special place where you live this is. And one of the things that's always impressed me about Tryon, part of my tale here, is what I call the historical architecture. I go around to a lot of states, do a lot of interviews, done a lot of research. North Carolina was a poor colony, and up until really not too long ago, a sort of poor state. No longer. It doesn't have a lot of early architecture. You could look at Tryon Palace, New Bern, Wilmington, a few plantations, but most of that pales in comparison to the other Atlantic states. So it doesn't have it, but you have it here. And I'm going to start with the block house. Now I think that's just a treasure. And you have plantations here. What you should all understand is in early Tryon history, and in early North Carolina history, once you go up the blue wall, there are no more plantations. And that makes you unique. Not only that, but you have 3 that still exist in one form or another. At least one of them, to me, is probably one of the best overall historical plantations I've seen Mill Scrivener. So you really do have a whole plethora of historical architecture here. You've got the toy factory. You've got the toy horses. You have slave cabins here, and I'll come back to that in your history in just a minute. You've got the Melrose Inn burns down a lot. You've also got the Pinecrest Inn. You have the old railroad depot, and you have Trade Street. Have all of you ever wondered why was it called Trade Street? I mean, not Main Street, not Broad Street, not Melrose Street, not Mill Street, but Trade Street. And that's a clue to early Tryon history. You've also got stone churches like the one we're in. And I will always tell you that every time I go into a town, especially a southern town, there are 2 things that tell me about that town. One's the churches. And you look here, you've got an Episcopal church. It means you have some rich folks here. You've got a Presbyterian church. It means there were people interested in knowledge. You've got a Catholic church here. You have to think about that and look at the South and look. And you've also got a Congregational church here. You have more Yankee influences here than in most small towns. Once you go west of Tryon, there aren't any more Congregational churches. There aren't any number of other churches. So this is an anomaly. And this street here, Melrose Street, Melrose Lane, the Circle, beautiful. And you should appreciate the beauty in which you live. It is outstanding. I also will tell you that I look at the dates that were founded, and most of them are more than a century old. And by the way, I live in Flat Rock now. I'm fond of telling Nita, if I go outside to 225 or 176, within a mile there are 50 churches. 90% are Baptists. Baptists. Different kinds of Baptists, and I won't even tell you, but they are. So you look at churches and their dates. Another defining feature of Tryon, and I always look at this every time you go into a town, how many delis do you have versus how many barbecue places? Now think of it. Think of the different towns, think of where the barbecue places are, etc. And look at the small kind of cafes. There's an old saying that locals have a power breakfast, but the town folk have a power lunch. And that's one of the differences, and that's part of what sets Tryon apart. You have a wonderful, just sort of array of historical structures here. Years ago, when I first came here, I was part of a tour of homes. You have some of those beautiful homes here. I know it's a pain to do those home tours, etc. They don't pay a lot of money, but I will tell you that they promote a town. They promote an identity. Second point I want to tell you is about how all this came into being. And yes, I'm going to talk about William Tryon. But first, I want to tell you about the old Drover's Road. It's the key to the history of this place. It started in Greenville, Tennessee, which at the time was part of North Carolina. And Jonesboro was named after a North Carolinian. And so all that was North Carolina. And Andrew Jackson, who lived up there, wasn't a North Carolinian, no matter what people say. That's Greenville, Tennessee, 77 miles down the French Broad, all the way through Hendersonville, through Saluda, comes right down 176, gets split, and it goes off to the right. When it goes off to the right, that's the old Drover's Trail. And the Drover's Trail existed from the 1770s, 1883, when the railroad came. And that's another chapter, not part of what I'm going to talk about today. But that Drover's Road was the interstate for this part of the country. I can tell you stories about stock stands every 5 miles apart, starting at Paint Rock in Madison County, going all the way down past Saluda. And at one time, Tryon was nothing more than a stock stand. One of those stock stands near Hendersonville, in 1 month in 1812, had 90,000 hogs. In 1 month. 250,000 people came up and down there on the average every single year. They brought with them everything in the world, and it was a trading path. And that was the clue, basically, as to how all this was formed. All the different towns that you see along the French Broad were formed by that Buncombe Turnpike. And Buncombe was all of this at one time. So basically, that Drover's Road is the clue as to why you're here today. It turned and went to Landrum, and then it split, Greenville and Spartanburg. And that is still true today. Now, I will also tell you that that Drover's Road spawned some of the richest and best and wealthiest families in western North Carolina. They have names like Mills, McDowell, Carson, Vance. It goes on and on. I'm going to digress and tell you a little bit about Zeb Vance. And he was born in Buncombe County, grew up in Madison County, and he and his father, David Vance, ran a stock stand. I have heard stories, read stories, looked at journals about Zebulon Baird Vance. He would memorize Shakespeare, the Bible, anything he could read, and he would go out and sit on a fence post, stand up and declaim Shakespeare to the hogs, to the mules, and to anybody who would listen. And at night he would come in, and you have to think of all of these places, and he would stand up and they'd give him a drink, or they'd give him a penny or something, and he would tell stories. He became an expert at imitating animal sounds. And he was one of the best stump warriors who ever lived. There is a story about him. When he was in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, after the Civil War, and there was a senator from Massachusetts who was saying why the South should still be occupied, and why Southern leaders should still be put in prison. And at key points, Zeb Vance would make an animal sound. A pig, a turkey, a duck. Then he would slam his fist down and stand up and say, "Who did that?" Who insulted the honorable senator from Massachusetts? And then he would call for a censure motion and sit down. He would repeat that day after day after day. And you know there's a statue of him in the U.S. Capitol building. but not in Asheville, North Carolina. But that Drover's Road and that turnpike was one of the keys. Have you ever wondered, by the way, why here in Tryon it's all about horses? If you go past Saluda, it's all about a bear and bears. And Saluda, its old amalgamated Indian name, means the place where chiefs came. There's a Saluda in almost every southern state that house any one of the 5 different civilized tribes. But you've got horses down here, and that's because of the old Drover's Road. They restocked here, and they came up, and they kept pens of horses here. And it was oxen and mules and horses that went north from here. But Tryon became known for its cow pens and also for its stock stands. And that was a key to it, and people knew they became, and then it wasn't Tryon, of course, but then they knew that you were, and they traded here all the time. That equestrian image goes back to the 1780s, and it's always been a part of who you are. One other thing I will tell you, there is a Methodist bishop. His name is Francis Asbury. You might have heard of him. You might not have. He rode up and down that turnpike. He rode all over 6 or 7 states. And he did it from 1771 for 45 years. If you ever want to know about how life was, tales of anything, read Francis Asbury's journals. And he will tell you. You have stories about the dark corner? Read Francis Asbury. He preached and he preached and he preached. He traveled something like 200,000 miles in his lifetime. And not only that, but he ordained just about everybody he met. Trying to get them to be a Methodist. And he wouldn't take any money. He took a vow of poverty. But his journal, and he would go 6,000 to 10,000 miles a year on a horse or on a mule. And he would never stay any place except at somebody's home or in a barn. And his journals, which you can read online, will give you the best depiction of early life here that I couldn't possibly describe. I'm going to talk about Indians, the Native Americans who were here first. And all of you know about the Cherokee. They have 40 towns, the over-hill towns, the middle towns, the valley towns, and here you have the lower towns. There was an Indian village at Harmon Field. Everybody knows that. It was semi-permanent. Had about 120 to 150 there. It was a trading village. And you have to look at the Cherokee. And the Cherokee they called themselves the principal people, because they thought themselves as the first among all the Indian tribes and everybody. They traded horses when they came. They raised corn, provisions, herbs. They were the best herbalists you'll ever know. But they were here first, and they stayed. And you can look at Tuxedo. That was another Indian village. And that's another Indian name for the place of bears. But that imprint is all over here. Highway 11, Cherokee City, I think is one of the most beautiful of all highways. And so many of those little towns that you see, former Cherokee villages. They are. And if you look at the Cherokee language, the double E on the end of a word tells you it came from the Iroquois. Look at the A, Siouan, the AW, the EW. It's a whole different language group. And they knew that. All of you know George Gist, G-I-S-T. He invented the Cherokee syllabary in 1821. By 1830, they were 100% literate. more so than their mountain neighbors, by the way. But they were. The Cherokee tale, by the way, is just one of the best I have read. I will tell you that they had clans, 7 clans. I've been over the 7 clans. They're called Long Hair, Blue, Wolf Deer, Wild Potato, Burt, Pink clans. At least 1 or 2 of those are sort of made up. Like the Wild Potato, they didn't have it here. But those are the first ones that came up. I could read you the Cherokee myth of creation, and it would be very familiar to you if you're a Christian, because it has all those elements in it. We call this, when they tell us about the clans, they tell us about this, and they tell us about the myth of creation, we call that, in my profession, Indian corn. And by the way, it's, I really like it, and I really like the Cherokee. The Trail of Tears, what happened to them is a tragedy, and the most tragic thing is that the Cherokee, when they were moved to the Trail of Tears, they had a choice between the federal government and the state of North Carolina, and they chose the state of North Carolina, which did not protect them. Comes the Civil War, they have a choice, the federal government or the state of North Carolina. They chose North Carolina. And in every single conflict, which historians say, the Cherokee have managed to choose the losing side. Now, Governor William Tryon, he has a bad reputation in history. He deserves it. He hated representative assemblies. He hated the General Assembly of North Carolina. He liked the upper council. He hated the lower council. If you look at Tryon Palace, you'll note that there's a place for the governor and the privy council, but not for the General Assembly. He didn't like for people to have a voice in government. He thought he knew best. North Carolina has a very long history of being anti-authoritarian, anti-regulation, anti-government. The least amount of government we like. North Carolina did not have a colonial capital. They had no place to keep their records. They went from place to place to place. They chose Raleigh because it was a tavern where most of the riders could get there overnight within 24 hours in 1791. But that's how that came to be. Tryon, when he came here as 7th governor of North Carolina, 1771 to 1777, he was an officer, a lieutenant colonel, in the British Army, and he always traveled with at least 100 armed men. And he didn't think it was a good day unless he could throw someone in jail or hang somebody. And he's the one who put down the regulating movement in Alamance in Orange County in 1768, 1771. And he's the one who negotiated the treaty at Brushy Creek with the Cherokee. They had a name for him. They called him the Wolf because he gobbled up things. And he was very unlikable. He established the Anglican Church here in North Carolina. The only thing I can tell you about the Anglican Church in early North Carolina, it never had a chance, period. And you couldn't be married or buried in early North Carolina unless you were an Anglican. He called all North Carolinians, 90-some-odd% of us, bastards. He said they were the poorest, most illegitimate society he'd ever met. He wouldn't dress properly, would not address him properly, and he did not like North Carolina at all. He married Margaret Wake, you know Wake County. She was quite different, very different from him. And he also put up Tryon Palace. What always struck me about William Tryon was the fact that in the midst of all this, he raised taxes on everything he could. Back then it wasn't the same as our tax system. mostly to pay his own salary, and to pay the militiamen, and to pay for his expenses, the 2 cannon, this, that, and everything else. And every time he did it, he got away with it. He was an excellent administrator, no matter how sort of a martinet he was. He built Tryon Palace. Can you imagine getting North Carolinians today to agree that it was 5,000 to 10,000 pounds to build it? But he got North Carolinians to build that in the midst of one of the worst uprisings in early history, and even up until the Civil War and the American Revolution. He did. It is very likely that William Tryon never visited here. He came close, but he never visited here. Highway 11 a little bit, you can go over here a little bit, but he really didn't visit very often. He sent emissaries instead. The treaty he made with the Fay-Talk-on-Play was already done. At that time, the white settlers outnumbered the Indians, and they had plantations here. They had all sorts of things, and he knew that. So they just acquiesced to something that was already done. I also want to talk about plantations. You have 3 of them here. And the purpose of plantations differed here. If you go down further south, go down to the coast. Vastly different. They provide provisions like corn, sugarcane, livestock, for horses, for drovers, for traders, for stock stands, for merchants. There were 328 in antebellum North Carolina. 328. There aren't a lot of them still around. For you to have 3 in one area, to know that there are no more once you go up the Blue Wall, it's just extraordinary. Now, they always located those plantations near a stream or in a valley. They always did. And of those 328 plantations, we have a definition in history of what's called a planter class. And to be part of that southern planter class that existed in the 1850s and 60s, you had to have more than 300 slaves. And there are over 325 different families that had more than 300 slaves. 4 were North Carolina. 4. So North Carolina did not have large plantations. And everyone knows that slavery basically was a very personal thing here in North Carolina. You worked with the slaves in the fields. There was a great deal of autonomy. It was still slavery, no matter what. Collecthorn was established here in 1764. That's before the treaty was made. John McDowell, 2,000 acres, was acquired by Thomas McIntyre. The manor house was built in 1837. It's over there in what they call the Golden Valley. You think of it because of the Beckler Mint, or you think of that because of the silver, about this, that, and everything else, but really because it was the most prosperous valley here in this entire area. The second was Green River. It is by far the most spectacular. It's the one that's best preserved. 360 acres, Joseph McDowell Carson. You can't get better names like that in western North Carolina. Built from 1804 to 1807. Note how early these are. Then Francis Cox of the Pennsylvania Coxes. I once interviewed Frank Cox up in Asheville. He still had some records of the Green River Plantation here in Polk County. They produced sugarcane, corn, cotton, and then, of course, my favorite is Mills Script. It's just plain beautiful. Have it located on a dirt road overlooking a river. It's just spectacular. 1820, John McIntyre, Governor Mills. You cannot have enough mills in western North Carolina. There's a former slave cabin there, by the way, made into a guest house, but it's just a wonderful remnant, and you're fortunate to have it. I also want to talk about slavery and also tell you how unique you are in terms of that Drover's Road, the Bundy Turnpike, the plantations. And what I want to say is this, that if you go away from the old turnpike, the French Broad River, 30 miles in each direction, African Americans almost cease to exist in western North Carolina. Almost all the blacks live within 30 miles of that river, one side or the other. You're going to have a few exceptions, like Rutherfordton. That's because of the mining district there, and that's because of exactly what Rutherford came to be. But basically, blacks were almost, they came from South Carolina and Georgia up the old turnpike, and they have some of the oldest families and churches in all of western North Carolina. And their population was small, never more than 15 or 20%, but they have existed. I do want to tell you, and I do want to end by saying that Tryon, basically, one other point. Hunters and lodges. Go over all your old records, look at all the old photos, and you always see a picture of hunters with guns. And they'll have a hide of a bear or a dead stag around. Go back to even before the Civil War when they had their first lithograph, and you will see that. Hunting and lodges have been a part of this culture since the very beginning, and they have. It divided. You divided how you hunted by class. You hunted with the hounds. You hunted in a lodge. Like you just went out and shot anything on your property. And it also became part of the folk culture here in western North Carolina and here where you live. I call part of that the deer hunting with Jesus folklore. You really have to think about that term, but it's a part of your culture as much as anything else. It differs today, and I don't even want to explain how that goes. And I'm going to close with this. For those of you in this room today, if you had to tell stories of Tryon today, what would you say? I'm going to tell you my impression. I can say this because I don't live here any longer. I'll go back up 176 afterward. You have so many historical structures here, which you appreciate, but not enough. You have a greater sense of civitas, of civic pride, of civic belonging, and of civic duty than most towns I've come across. And you really have to think about that. Almost all of you here in this room participate in some way, give back to this community. Do you really understand what your little concerts, your little pocket parks, and your little areas you have here mean? And you have one of the greatest treasures and attractions. It's called Harmon Field. I mean, how many towns of this size or in general have that? Look at your public places that you have. You also have arts, crafts, and fine arts. And that sets you apart. I grew up in Texas in a family where my mother went to the 6th grade, my dad to the 7th. And it's startling in my old age to find that I'm an elitist. Most people in this room are. Be proud of it. There are obligations that go with it. Tryon embraces those. You really do. You have an inclusiveness that includes east part of your town, as well as your downtown and your neighborhood. You really do. You have a tolerance for nature, for gardens, for clubs, recreation, and for your neighbors. Do you realize how socially incohesive we are as a nation? But not here in Tryon. And that's one of the stories I think that I would tell about you. This is not a dark corner. Long, long past, where counties from 2 states come together, outlaws, ruffians, closed clan societies, kinship, those things have changed a great deal. But you have a greater sense of openness, of acceptance, and tolerance here. You should be proud of it. You really should. You do have stories to tell, and you have tales to refurbish about who you are. But I will tell you that this really is just one of the very best places I've ever lived, and I thank you for that.
Thank you, Milton. I have a couple announcements to make before we disband, but I'm going to ask for questions first. If anyone would like to ask, I see you right there. Let's go ahead.
Milton, I visited Tryon Palace some years ago, and the docent told a story, and your search may know whether or not it was true, about the people rising up against Tryon, Governor Tryon, and that he had to be spirited in the middle of the night to keep from getting tarred and feathered, and he was spirited away in his nightdress. You know, he didn't have time to put his clothes on.
This happened 3 times to William Tryon. 3 times. And when he left here for North Carolina and so forth, I'm sure most of the local officials went to New York City. Same thing. He had to, in the middle of the night, go out on a little frigate out and so forth, and to escape and so forth. Well, and then he went up to Boston. Same thing happened in Boston. So William Tryon had that sort of reputation. So it's exaggerated a little, but still true enough to be a great tale.
Wanda.
Milton, when you were talking about the groups and the tribes under the Cherokee, you mentioned the blue. Does that have anything to do with the blue people in Kentucky and Tennessee? Or the Melangians?
I love myths in history. And the Melangians is one of the wonderful myths about the lost colony that they came up and they've intermarried with and so forth. And the same thing is true if you go down to, my gosh, the Croatans, you go down to Pembroke, etc., and you go up here. And the Melangians, sort of supposedly 4 or 5 families, the overhill towns of Irwin, Tennessee, and on over to Jonesboro along the river there. But basically, it's a myth. And they've done genetic tests, DNA and everything else. It's a wonderful story about how people from the coast came up, intermarried with the Indians, then the blacks came, the Indians came, they became Melangians, and they have the same 10 families. That's true for any southern community.
Anyone else? I have a couple of questions. Could you think of anything good to say about Tryon other than he was an excellent administrator?
Yes, I can. He was very, very good a great administrator, but he understood factions, and he understood politics, and he understood his role in it. And so I admire him for many, many traits. And he married well. So, yes.
Is it true that we don't have an authentic portrait of him, but do of his wife?
We do a Margaret, and we have one that we think is of him. And he didn't live a long time, by the way. He died in 1788, born in 1729. And he did not go home in disgrace like Burgoyne and several other British generals. And he actually had a very good life after he left here. So, and by the way, he was an excellent Army officer. I mean, he really inspired his troops. Otherwise, how could you get North Carolinians to shoot other North Carolinians? Well, maybe you can.
Milton, can you tell us why Tryon was named after him?
Yes, because he negotiated the treaty, and also because he liked having things named after him. The highest point, Peak, and there is a Tryon County, New York, there's a Tryon, New York, and there's a Tryon Village in New York City, and a Tryon Street, a Tryon Park. And it seems that a great many politicians like to have things named after them. And Tryon, by the way, he was that way. He had a very large ego, but he really was good at what he did. But he just didn't understand Americans and not our idea of representative government at all.
Can you please, sir, forgive me for my rabid curiosity, but can you tell me why Tryon Estates is called Tryon Estates? It's in Columbus, and why the Tryon Equestrian Center is in TV?
Everybody here knows the answer to that. You have become a brand. You are a brand. And you can have South Carolina, you can have, I think there's even a Tryon something or other just at Lake Hartwell too.
Oh, sure.
So you're a brand. Everybody loves you and everybody wants to be like you and everybody wants to live here.
I've got one in back ahead.
Last question?
I think we had one back here. We may have a couple more actually, if that's okay. One in back. Told not Ellen over here. Has one.
I was wondering if you could tell us something about this treaty. I'm not sure what you're speaking of.
About what?
The treaty?
It was a treaty, I think it was 1767, and it was negotiated at Brushy Creek with several Indian chiefs, Cherokee, and I think one or two others, Creek Indians. And basically the Cherokees ceded all these lands in western North Carolina to North Carolina and opened these up for settlement without regard for Indians. And I will tell you one thing, that North Carolina and South Carolina, because of that treaty, and because of the split, even as I'm speaking today, there's somebody in Raleigh, somebody in Columbia who's poring over a map, trying to figure out exactly where that county line is. How many of you secretly are South Carolinians, etc. So the answer is, it was about land and territory and who had the rights to this. And North Carolina, by the way, has had a lot of boundary disputes. With Georgia, we had a war with Georgia, up in Highlands. And South Carolina, we fought their militia several times, and they fought ours, and but it's just, we're Southerners.
What did the Cherokee get out of the treaty?
Sorry?
What did the Cherokee get out of the treaty?
The chiefs who negotiated it were called medal chiefs. And they were given a medal and say, oh, we're going to trade with you. Here's a medal. You represent the Cherokee. Sign the treaty. And they weren't the real chiefs. So they didn't get much out of it. They got a few trinkets, and they got some money and some trade goods. And by that time, the Cherokee here could not even raise their own corn and feed themselves. They had so many epidemics go through their villages. They were weak, and 20,000 when we were first settled here, and they were less than 5,000 by the time the treaty was made. So they didn't get much of anything, and the people who got something were the medal chiefs who didn't really represent Cherokee society at all. So absolutely not much.
I have one more question, and that is, I read that the last battle of the Cherokee and the settlers was at Round Mountain. And I'd like to know where the location is of that.
Good question.
Anybody? Brown Mountain? One of the things that we did here in the Carolinas, we named mountains for colors, for their shape, and Brown Mountain supposedly is over here somewhere near Lake Etowah. And it's going up, and I don't know exactly where it is, to be honest.
Was it Brown Mountain or Round?
Round.
Oh, I'm sorry. No,
I was wondering if it was Chocolate Drop.
No.
I don't really know.
One very quick follow-up question is, did Ostinaco go to England after the treaty or before the treaty?
I think that he went probably after the treaty.
I believe that's right. The Cherokee chief, I suppose is correct to call him the chief, is it?
He was the chief.
Went to England and met George III, I believe, is the story anyway. But, I have one final question, very quick one. You said there were 328 plantations in North Carolina. Do you know how that would compare with South Carolina or Virginia or Georgia?
South Carolina dwarfed us, not necessarily in numbers, because a lot of North Carolina plantations, like I think George Moore had 10 plantations and 75 slaves. So you could have 3 plantations, 3,000 slaves in South Carolina. But South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia, those were really the sort of slave societies. We were never a slave society, and the number of slaves and percentages never rose above 25%. And that's a historical threshold in North Carolina. The African American population has never been more than 25%. It is in some areas, New Brunswick, Wilmington, Cape Fear, New Bern, those counties along the coast. But no, it's a completely different society. And our histories will tell you that you don't have Creole societies forming in North Carolina. Blacks don't have their own language, don't come from the same place, and they don't do this, and so there are small groups that basically you don't have what you have in Charleston, what you have in the Low Country, and speaking a common dialect, having Ogeechee or having Gullah and having whole groups, there were some here, and you have 2 or 3 historically black communities here, and one of them, of course, is in Peter Ridge. But basically, you just didn't have large groups like you had.
Yeah, we live in Landrum, at Ingleside Plantation, on the old historic 176, which would run right through present-day Landrum High School. So we live and the plantation was right up from Hackett River. There's a creek in my backyard, and I find pottery. So, and I think my daughter read where President Andrew Johnson he referenced Ingleside Plantation, and Mr. Landrum, I think, was the one. I think he married into the Ingleside. Do you know anything about Ingleside Plantation? It's still there. It burnt down twice, and some of the structure is still there. But
I can't imagine any structure in the 18th or 19th century not burning down at least once. It's true. And by the way, Landrum and that whole district, the old 176, completely different history from here. And so you're absolutely right. Thank you very much.